You know, this test that you guys have come up with is really cool. I mean, it's fun to see what the cars can actually do.
It's not to step on the magazines of the era, but back then testing was so horrifically unscientific.
You know, muscle cars are mythical. They have these legends around them. Nothing was ever as fast as, say, a big block Chevelle or a Hemi Challenger. Well, was that actually the case?
The factories were known to throw test cars at them that may have been a little bit lighter, you know, may not have had soundproofing, may have had a little bit of port work done to the heads.
It's fun that you guys are actually taking 7 cars that were at Legendary Motor Cars. You're going to actually put them to the test and see what the cars actually did.
Any one of the 7 competitors could be a winner if you pick the right magazines.
The cars have legends that are going to be very, very hard to live up to. So it's going to be fun to see where they actually stand.
This portion of the Dream Car Garage Muscle Car Shootout is brought to you by Year One, your restoration and performance headquarters.
So, why the 0 to 60 test? Probably because the speed limit was 60 miles an hour as the Enthusiast magazine started up. That index number, 0 to 60, became very important. And with the use of this little device, we'll figure out how that's actually done. Now, just...
don't worry about it. Used it lots, works great.
It measures g-forces and time to compute distance, which allows it to extrapolate horsepower and torque. This allows the user to gauge the benefits of any performance modifications that they've made.
Now, Peter's going to be driving a lot of different cars in a lot of different scenarios, so to keep things fair, we'll give him 3 runs at each test. And it only takes 5.677 seconds for the excuses to begin.
All right, I can try and make excuses. The tires are only 14-inch. I spun them too much every single time. Now keep in mind we're leaving 25 pounds of pressure in the tires the way you would drive it on the street for all the tests. If we drop the pressures way down, maybe it would hook up a little better. And if I had a little more practice, I think I could get it to hook better. But we got 3 runs, that's it. First time I took the car up to about 2,500 RPM, it spun the tires and then fell over on itself again. Figured I need more RPM, I took it up to 3,000 RPM and I just broke the tires loose. So I think the middle run was the good one. We have 3 runs because the first run I got too much wheel spin. The last run I bogged a little bit off the line. I didn't give it enough gas. The middle one I think we got it pretty much right, hooked up, worked pretty good. Got a little rattle in the muffler after that. First time off the line, it bogged a little. Second time, I gave it a little too much RPM, spun the tires. Third time, hooked up pretty nice, a little less RPM. Thing hooked really hard. A lot of the guys think these bosses don't run. I'll tell you, at the low end, it worked really nice. Well, very rarely when you think of great muscle cars do you think of a Buick. You probably think of a Buick as your grandfather's car. Well, by 1970, they had it figured out. They had the 455 Stage 1, 510 foot-pounds of torque at 2,800 RPM. You were barely off idle, and you could roast the tires with that sort of torque. Think about this, a 69cc combustion chamber, intake ports that flowed better than the 455 Pontiac and the Chrysler. This motor weighed 72 pounds more than a small block Chevy and a whole 100 pounds less than a big block Chevy. The quadrajet carburetor, 730 CFM. Intake valves on the motor, 2 12-inch intake, a 175 exhaust with great flowing heads. The combustion chamber was also designed, he was one of the first guys that understood how flame propagation worked in the combustion chamber, and he unshrouded the valves, making a very efficient head. These cars weren't lightweight. An automatic weighed 3,800 pounds, a 4-speed weighed 37 and change. Not all GSs had disc brakes, but when you ordered it, you got an 11-inch rotor in the front, which helped haul this car down.
Buick Motor Division certainly isn't known for building outrageous performance cars. dealer said, hey, we need a muscle car. We got to find a body platform.
So you had the chassis, you had all the ingredients to build a muscle car. They had the hardware, so why not? It's not too difficult to take it that extra step and jump into the ring.
You know, the factory engineers in particular, Buick, did a great job. They built probably one of the best sleepers of all time. Year One's had a fast race for the last 3 years at a Bristol Bash, and Buick's won it every year.
Well, I think the first or third run was the best. The second run, it just bogged off the line. You don't get a second chance here to 60. It's not like a quarter mile where the pure grunt's going to take you through the top end. The first run, the car hooked up really nice. I think the 0 to 60 time is going to be good. The second run on the 1-2 shift, it felt like it slipped a little bit, so I'm not going to do a third run. I want to save this car for the quarter mile in the Burnout contest. I think run 1 and 2 are going to be my strong runs. If it bogs, it's all over, you're done. So one of the first 2 runs is going to be the quick one.
Well, the big surprise after 1 of 5 rounds is the Boss 9 Mustang, and look at the Chevelle. Although the competition's very close, it's going to have some making up to do. When we come back, we'll bring this whole thing to a full stop.
Muscle car back in the day, you knew the thing wasn't going to stop fast, but you hoped it was going to stop. Now, this is a part of a rounded performance test, so we're going to have to test braking. You didn't like my idea with the wristwatch and the whole speedometer thing.
Not at all. So what are you going to do?
So Steve Ruiz comes up from Stop Tech Brakes. Now, he's got this Stalker radar gun. He took it all apart, did something to it, plugged it into the back of his laptop, so you just have to get to around 60 miles an hour and hit the brakes.
You don't have a clue what he's doing. You can't even explain it to him, can you? You just know it works.
You've got to have faith that it will work. So we have faith in Steve. Now, as far as friction material is concerned, we wanted to make it fair. Didn't quite know how, so we went to Paul Fix from Classic Tube.
Through these late 60s, early 70s cars, they were all single piston, disc brake calipers up front, drum brakes in the back. But to equalize all these cars, we had to have pads and shoes that were identical. So Satisfied came out with this perfect set for all these cars, custom made. They should perform, as far as braking goes, equivalent. Now, the real test will be whose system is the best as far as GM, Ford, or Chrysler.
So basically, Satisfied supplied the brake pads, Paul Fix installed them, Steve Ruiz is setting up the actual test, he knows what he's doing, and you did nothing.
So obviously Peter doesn't see the value in a good long nap. Now, lest you think that 60 to 0 isn't exciting, take a look at this.
First time I just hit the brakes too hard, locked up all 4 wheels. Second time I hit the brakes, the rear ones grabbed, it started pitching the car sideways. I saw the cameraman actually running, so I lifted out of the brake pedal, terrible one. The last one, it's braking as good as it can. I think what we're doing is we're rolling these cars back and forth a whole bunch. They got the self-adjusters on the rear brake drums. It's expanding, and actually the rears are coming on before the front, causing the cars to lock up. Definitely an exciting car under braking. First time I braked really hard and I could feel the back wheels lock up.
The problem with getting the drum brakes to be a balance at their maximum potential to slow the car and not actually lock up. So a lot of the cars were limited in their performance by the rear drum.
Dick Teague, the chief styling guy for AMC, decided in '65 that they had to build something with a little bit more performance and a little bit more style. Let's face it, if you had an AMC, you were a little bit different back then. What he came up with is the AMX, which stood for American Motors Experimental. Well, they'd learned from all the other manufacturers, in order to produce a great muscle car, you had to go with a small, fairly lightweight package, put a fairly big motor in it, in this case a 390, 315 horsepower, but it wasn't so much the horsepower number that was impressive, it was the torque number, 425 foot-pounds of torque. As far as suspension went, when you ordered the Go package, you got Cipher springs, you got better shocks, you got disc brakes up front, you got the E70 Redline tires, and you also got the 2 stripes over top of the hood. not a bad deal for just under 300 bucks. The power plant in this car, most people opted for the 390. It was basically a 343, but a little bit tougher. Forged crank, forged rods, bigger bearings. That helped on high RPM.
Well, the AMX, it's one of the lighter weight performers, I think, there. So it's so as far as that goes, it's got plenty of sport to it.
I think that will give it an advantage. I mean, you know, simple physics states that if you're trying to accelerate a smaller mass than something else, then it's probably going to accelerate quicker. We'll see how it turns out, but I expect the lightweight will help the AMX both in drag racing and in slalom.
The first time was almost scary. As soon as I hit the brakes hard, the car just darted all over the place.
Yeah, the brakes slow the wheel and tire assembly, but the tires actually slow the car.
Second time, trying to threshold brake a little bit more. It worked better. The third one stopped nice and straight. That was by far our best run. This car under braking, pleasantly surprised. No drama whatsoever. Threshold braking, very easy to modulate the pedal. Easy car to stop straight. The first run was a little bit scary. The pedal was spongy and it just felt like it was going to go to the floor. It felt okay at the end. Now it's sort of funny that these things are getting better with each braking, and I think what we're doing is finally getting some heat into the pads and into the rotor, and that's actually stopping better. It seems like these brakes get better with every stop, and again, I think we're putting heat into the pads. The other thing is these bias ply tires tend to really squirm around, so if you start to get them locked up, you're not going to come back. They're not as easy to modulate as a radial tire.
The tendency of the drums, that it's self-energizing, so it doesn't respond quite as quickly. There's a little hysteresis, so if you reach the limit, you're pretty much stuck there. It doesn't respond and back off of the limit as quickly as this. So once the car's out of balance, it's very hard to bring it back.
You know, every time I do this test, I realize 60 miles an hour is pretty fast in one of these old cars to just be slamming on the brakes. Try it next time you're on the road. Make sure you look in the rearview mirror before you do it, though. Nothing exciting about this car under braking. The only downside is the floats are set a little bit too low, so when you brake hard, the car really wants to stall.
Well, after the second of 5 rounds, the Chevelle redeems itself in braking of all things, and then rockets up the chart to tie itself with the Boss 9 Mustang for the overall lead. When we come back, Peter gets up on the wheel of 7 great dream cars. This portion of the shootout is brought to you by AutoZone, carrying the Grand Sport line of high-performance pads at over 3,300 stores in the U.S. Get in the zone. AutoZone.
Now, good handling in the muscle car context is not crashing while you change directions in the thing. But we needed to have a test that would compare all the cars fairly. So here's what we did. We set some cones 70 feet apart. Now, what Peter's going to do is enter that course in a slalom and drive by a kind of an antiquated timing system spread out over 250 feet. That amount of time will be our comparison for all 7 cars. I feel Peter approaching me from the rear. It makes me nervous because that's how he makes most of his money.
You know, your wife says there's 3 things that never come out of your wallet: your money, your credit card, and the thing that causes that circular impression. Poor girl, I don't know how she puts up with you. Anyway, Corky has supplied us with a bunch of tires from Coker Tire. These guys manufacture original type tires for all of the muscle cars, and actually most of the cars from the 20s all the way up. They supplied us with exactly the same tire that the car left the factory with. This car is an absolute pig through that course. 3,800 pounds, no power steering. You're one way or you're the other way. You just can't control the car. No fun again through the slalom. Pleasantly surprised with this car. Went through there faster than I thought it could. Again, the car, even though it feels heavier, turns in quite nicely, and you can really modulate the throttle here. You can throttle steer the car a little bit. All in all, with the front and rear sway bar, nice car through the pylons. Really, the Boss 429 and the Boss 302, Ford had other ambitions other than making killer street cars. What they really had in mind is to homologate the Trans Am cars or the motor, and to homologate the Boss 429 motor for NASCAR. Even though the 429 wasn't going to go into a Mustang, they decided to put it into the 3,500-pound car. It came with a factory rear sway bar, 11.3-inch disc brakes in the front, and the regular drums on the back. All Boss 429s, as a matter of fact, all Boss cars, 351s and 302s, were only available with a 4-speed, always a top loader. Standard gear ratio was a 391, 411, and 430 were optional. Well, let's get to the motor. It came with steel crank, steel rods, actually a billet crank, 4-bolt mains, very, very tough bottom end. But the real magic was in the heads. The heads had a port that you could almost stuff a beer bottle in. All aluminum heads. Instead of head gaskets, they actually used O-rings. Aluminum intake, 735 Holley on top, the air grabber hood, which was functional from inside. Even though it was only rated at 375 horsepower, it was much stronger than that. Torque, 450 foot-pounds of torque, a big number in a 3,500-pound car. The suspension, no different than a Boss 302, which was now a Trans Am contender. Other than the extra weight up front, which was offset slightly by putting the battery in the back, this car was really a fairly good handling car.
The Boss 429 Ford Mustang is certainly one of the strangest cars ever built by any of the big three manufacturers.
And that's because it's an exotic race engine. It was a very powerful race engine. There's a lot of potential in the Boss 429 motor when you really talk about building one for race.
You know, they built the car to homologate the Hemi to take on Chrysler's Hemi. You know, the 429 engine was brand new. They had to put 500 in some car, at least, to make Bill France happy.
But as it was introduced in the Mustang, it didn't quite meet what expectations people had for it in the late 60s. They were looking, for a Chrysler Hemi killer, because Ford was taking the stab after Chevy had. They were looking for something that would run like a ZL1. What came out was a fast car, but it wasn't quite what people thought it was, so it got this reputation of being a soft runner or a pig.
Carcraft in Michigan hand-built the cars. The finished product was really lamented in the press. It was way too nose-heavy. They had to do so much to tone the Boss 429 engine down to make it livable on the street that it gutted the performance, supposedly.
You'll find out that, no, it's not a high 11-second, low 12-second screamer, but I think it'll nose out every single one of these cars in this competition.
And yet, through all that, when you look back on Mustang performance, what is probably the ultimate Mustang? I'd have to say it's probably Boss 429.
Definitely not the best car around the pylons. The car wants to step out a little, but really easy to throttle steer. Power steering works really nice. So a very predictable car, but definitely wants to slide around.
After the first three cars in our slalom test, the Chevelle and the Mustang are very close. The Hurst Olds in third place. When we come back, we'll run the rest of these great muscle cars through the cones.
Well, the real thing with any of these muscle cars comes down to the motor. Two options were available in 1969, the Ram Air 3 and the Ram Air 4. As far as transmissions, you could get the 3-speed Hydromatic, or you could get the 4-speed, the M21 or the M20 Muncie. The standard rear end for a Judge was a 355. You could order the Posse. As far as braking power, well, 11.1-inch front rotor did most of the stopping. A 9.5-inch rear drum, it helped a little bit. The 400 Ram Air 3 motor had 10.75 to 1 compression, a hydraulic cam, a D-port head, cast iron intake, and a Rochester Quadrajet.
Judge really signifies everything that the GTO stood for. Primarily, that's performance. GTOs were always good performing cars.
And the GTO came out early. It's commonly thought of as being the grandfather of the muscle car movement.
But they had some really good marketing men behind them. Jim Wangers, of course, is a genius. John DeLorean. Even though he had some hard times later on, of course, DeLorean was a really good car guy. So they pushed the car. A prime example is, of course, the famous Car and Driver cover, GTO versus GTO.
I'd say Pontiac really did steal Italy's thunder in taking that, because they applied it to a car that had much more mass appeal and mass accessibility, such that who could afford a Ferrari GTO?
The GTO Judge we've got here is a Ram Air 3 model. It's a 366 horse version.
Back then, Pontiac had its own powertrains, and they were super smooth running, super torquey.
If it was a Ram Air 4 car, it would probably run better. While on paper, it's only a 4 horsepower difference or so. There's a world of difference between a Ram Air 4 and a Ram Air 3.
Pontiac just really knocked it out of the park, and they did it from the very first year on forward.
Felt really good. The power steering feels good. Throttle response is good. You can kind of power through the corners. The only thing that's a little lacking are the tires, and you can really feel them roll over, and you can feel a lot of body roll on this car. This car is the shocker so far of the whole test in slalom. I can't believe a car this heavy, this car has air conditioning, would go through the pylons the way it did. The way the sway bars work on this car, it stayed fairly level. Nice handling car, and it shouldn't be. It just did. What are you going to say about a car with no power steering, that weighs this much, torsion bar front suspension, and a 2.4 barrel setup that you can't really modulate the throttle? Either you're in the one or you're into the both. Just not a fun car to drive on the slope. This car is exactly what you'd expect. Short wheelbase, light, nimble car. Went through the slalom very nicely.
Well, after 3 of 5 rounds, the Buick GS and the AMX do surprisingly well, taking the Buick to a first-place tie in the AMX all the way to 3rd. When we come back, we separate the men from the boys, and the quarter-mile runs begin.
Well, the next test is really straightforward. It's the quarter mile. We're going to just relax. We're going to start with the burnout to get the tires hot. Now, with street tires, you don't want to go into the water. You just want to go beside them, get them nice and warm. Then we're going to stage the car. Then we're going to launch the car, and then we're going to figure out what the ET is, the elapsed time. It's going to be somewhere in the 13 to 14 second range, and we're going to find out what the mile an hour is.
So when these yellow lights come on, Peter knows that he's got about 1.5 seconds before he has to leave. Now, if the red light goes on, he's going to remember that summer he spent in Amsterdam, and he could be sitting on the line for hours.
This car performed exactly like I'd expected. Easiest car to shift, nice and strong out of the hole, but compared to the other big block cars here, it just doesn't have the grunt at the top end. I mean, it's still pulling, but not pulling the same as the rest of them. Disappointed in the car, actually not in the car, in the clutch. On the first pass, the car worked pretty good. It bogged off the line. It's the only multi-carb car here that we're running. The second and third pass, I had to stop power shifting in the higher gear, the 3/4 shift, slipping huge amounts. So this car, I mean, it did what it did, but it could go faster, just we need a new clutch. 1970, the gloves were definitely off. And what Chevy produced then with the Chevelle, the SS, the LS6 would never be duplicated again. It was the only year they had a 450 horsepower motor in a production car. Pretty awesome. And it wasn't just a bunch of hype. That motor, the Mark IV, was the ultimate in big block performance out of Chevy. course, 4-bolt mains. It was already pre-drilled for an external oiling system for the guys real serious about racing. Steel cranks, steel rods, had 3/8 push rods, 7/16 rod bolts. I mean, it was a serious piece of equipment. Closed chamber heads that breathed phenomenal through two 19-inch intake valve. I mean, that's a big valve. Solid lifters, 520 lift, 316 duration out of the crate. 780 Holley on aluminum intake. It was the complete package, though. The car wasn't as heavy as it looked. Standard gear was a 331. You could opt for a 410 ratio. This one here comes with the Turbo 400. Transmissions, of course, the M22 Muncie was the ultimate tranny, the rock crusher, and it sounded like it was doing just that. A lot of cars came equipped with M21s. What's ironic is a lot of these cars with sticks came with bench seats.
Throughout its history, Chevrolet has identified a lot of their special models with special codes and letters and things. SS comes to mind. Regular production option codes, RPO codes, are also very popular in Chevrolet lexicon. Z28 is probably the most famous. Of course, LS6 carries a lot of water as well. And if you think about the history of Chevrolet muscle, I don't think it gets any better, really, than the 70 LS6 Chevelle that combined everything that really signified the muscle car era. Cool styling, really big engine, lots of speed, lots of performance. It really sums up Chevrolet's involvement in the muscle car period really well.
I think it still is considered a king of the hill. There's a handful of cars that outpowered it, but those were very, very, a Z01 Camaro or power to weight ratio, the 427 Cobras. But now we're talking about cars that are yet even more exotic, more valuable, and more hard to come by today. So when you're really talking about muscle cars that you could walk into your factory showroom and order right up if you so have the inclination, the LS6 really comes out as being the top of the heap.
Chevrolet did a pretty good job of making sure that you could order your LS6 however you wanted. Of course, you paid for it that way. This silver car behind us here is probably going to pay the price for having the tall gear and the automatic transmission.
Quite frankly, I'm a little disappointed in the LS6. For starters, I think it's got a 331 gear in this car. With the automatic, it just doesn't pull as hard as a lot of the other LS6s I've driven. First time I spun the tires, that was 100% my fault. Second time, I don't like the shift either in this thing. It's a Turbo 400, and the governor is 100% stock. A lot of guys would rework that, so it's shifting kind of at the wrong RPM for drag racing. A little disappointed in this car.
Well, after the first three cars, it's the Chevelle, the only car down into the 13s, keeping in mind this is a very warm and humid day. When we come back, we'll run the rest of the cars through 1,320 feet. This portion of the shootout is brought to you by NPD, taking the frustration out of restoration. Your source for quality products, great prices, huge in-stock inventories, and personal service.
One there, I tried heating up the tires a fair bit. I got them a little too hot. The thing kind of bogged after it bit in and it rolled over on itself, so I think the best run is going to be the second one. That's the winner. Well, if mild was good, then wild would be great, and Oldsmobile took the lead on that. They had this dual snorkel hood scoop, which looked like two mailboxes stuck on the hood. They had a rear wing that was actually taken off the design of a Cessna that was at the Lansing Airport. 455 HO, another one to join the club. Over 500 foot-pounds of torque, 380 horsepower. Keep in mind these torque numbers are at around 3,000 RPM. Again, just about off of idle, these things are making all sorts of power. This one's also equipped with the Turbo 400 and a dual-gate shifter. The shifter is kind of a cool item, obviously coming out of Hurst, where it made it almost idiot-proof to shift it into neutral or reverse by mistake. As far as internals for the motor, well, 10.5 to 1 compression, a great set of flowing heads, a great flowing exhaust, and a Rochester Quadrajet is what completed the entire package. Now, as far as rear-end gear ratios, 342 was a standard gear ratio, 391 was optional. This one has the 342. Now, all the cars that we're running today, we made sure they all had posi, so they all had the same bite off the line.
Where does Oldsmobile fit into the lexicon? Boy, I tell you what, I think it was the most car you could buy at the time for the money. When you really balance out, I want to go fast, but I want to do it with style and comfort.
Somewhere in the late 60s, George Hurst and Linda Vaughn and Oldsmobile hooked up and started building some very special 442s. Actually, they're not even 442s, they're Hurst Olds. And you know, really those cars kind of took on the image of George Hurst. George Hurst was a character. Part of his image or persona, I guess you could say, is having Linda Vaughn around him all the time, and she's certainly an icon of the muscle car era.
Olds really hit it hard with the visual stuff. They had the great twin snorkel hoods, they had the super stripe kit.
Now GM had of course, the 400 cubic inch limit and intermediates. George Hurst had a good idea. He said, that's GM's rule, that's not my rule. I'm going to put the big car 455 in the intermediate A body, and that ought to give it plenty of performance.
I think the first run was the best of the bunch. The second and third run, it just seemed to fall flat on its face, and I probably should have given it a little more RPM, like did a little longer brake stand. I didn't. The tires hooked up really well, and it just went bah. So first run's the best one of the bunch. Pleasantly surprised with this car. First two times I lit the tires up a little bit too much. The last time it hooked up just nice. Easy car to power shift. And all those guys that say Boss 9s don't work, first run, again, it bogged a little bit. The second run, I gave it way too much throttle. I spun the tires. The third run was pretty good. It's all about getting used to the tires. I'm certain if I had 2 or 3 more runs, we could run a little quicker, but the rules are 3 runs. That's what we gave it, and that's the time.
Well, there you have it. 4 cars down into the 13s, making a fairly respectable run. Unfortunately, the Challenger, not so much.
Ready for Burnout?
We'll do a whole lot of them when we come back.
So now we find ourselves in a tie between the LS6 and the Boss 9. Now, the test that Peter absolutely insisted on is the one that there's no real quantitative way to measure. But every single muscle car enthusiast knows what we're talking about when we talk about a earth-shattering, earth-moving, smoky, big, rotten burnout. Now, you do know how to do a burnout, don't you?
Do you know how to eat?
Oh, now that's harsh.
Again, the automatic's at a little bit of a disadvantage, trying to get the tires to spin really hard. We can't get it spinning hard enough with the brake stand to start with. If we loosened off the rear shoes, I'm certain we'd do a way better burnout, but we said we're going to test them the way we drive them in all the tests. You know, I was a little disappointed with the quarter-mile time on this car. The 331 gears, well, it helps in the burnout. This thing does a great burnout. Once you get them spinning, again, it just wants to keep spinning and spinning and spinning. And these Firestones, they go up and smoke quite nicely. Hemi was really introduced in 1964, the 426, in order to go, of all things, NASCAR racing. What seemed like a lightweight car, in reality wasn't. These cars are 3,800 pounds, and with a torsion bar front suspension, let's face it, you're just not going to handle. Well, as far as the motors went, well, that was the heart of any muscle car. Here we had a crossbolt block, steel crank and rods, aluminum heads, and of course, the hemispherical combustion chamber and ports that flowed very nicely. An aluminum intake, 2 Carters on top. It was an aggressive package. 490 foot-pounds of torque, 425 horsepower. Now behind that, they had to make sure the trannies were tough. You could either get a torque flight, 727, or you could get a stick with the Hurst pistol grip like this car here. Out back, you could get an 8 3/4, or you could get the 9 3/4 Dana 60 rear end. Standard ring and pinion was a 323, and you could go all the way up to a 410 if you so desired, and obviously a posi was almost a must in a Hemi car.
What can you say about the term Hemi? I mean, it's just magic.
It still survives today. It's one of those iconic words that came from the muscle car era that people who don't even really know muscle cars seem to know in their back of their head means performance.
There's just no getting around the fact, that the term Hemi has so much weight behind it. That it again is probably the best known name in muscle car history.
The Dodge Hemi design got tapped by people who want to accelerate the fastest as the way to go, and was carried forward, and nobody's ever, gotten to the point where you're looking for an extra 5 miles per hour or an extra 10th and said, if we back up and try this other direction, I think that's where our limit is. So it's almost as if the Hemi has proved out as being the way to make horsepower.
Again, if you want to take one particular engine that just, is the icon of the muscle car era, it's got to be the Hemi.
Well, we said we were going to do a real-life test. The clutch is almost out of this car. I knew I had to dump the clutch high enough to get them spinning, but I didn't want to take the clutch right out of it. Did a really good burnout, but unfortunately, with all the other things going on with this car, I feel sorry this car hasn't been done justice for the simple fact the clutch is slipping so bad. Gotta admit, I'm a little disappointed in this burnout. I'm trying to launch it in second gear so I don't have to shift right away and lose all that momentum, but the thing doesn't have quite enough torque like the other cars. These red lights don't light up as nice as the Goodyears either. No doubt this car did the best burnout. Launch it at about 5,000 in second gear, and it just doesn't stop spinning. I can just kind of feather it at 5 to 5,500 and just keep smoking. Great burnout car. Like the Firestones light up a little earlier, a little quicker than the Goodyears. No problem roasting the tires, and like all the sticks, we're doing the burnout out of second gear.
Coming up on the Muscle Car Shootout, we will tally up all the scores. 35 years ago, this collection of cars were arguably the fastest cars on the planet. Are they still the fastest? No, and not by a long shot, yet the legend of the American muscle car is stronger now than ever. And why is that? Because those of us who were around at the birth of this era of muscle witnessed something that will never, ever happen again in the automotive industry. With 7 manufacturers participating in a King of the Hill competition, the beneficiary was the average Joe who could walk into a showroom at age of 19 or 20 and actually have the wherewithal to buy one of these weapons, which had few equals in the day. 5 of 7 of these cars have as much as 426 cubic inches of displacement or more. Gas was cheap back in the day, and that is exactly the basis on which we tested these cars. Now, the guys from Legendary didn't tweak these cars. They delivered them the same way they'd been delivered from the showroom back in the day. But Peter definitely beat on these cars is if they still cost about $5,000, not 20 or 30 times that amount. This is the real deal. We tested these cars hard.
So in real time, at the end of the Dream Car Garage Muscle Car Shootout, based on the Burnout alone, the tie between the Chevelle and the Mustang, for your money?
Gotta be the Boss 429. All day this car performed 100%. When it came to the Burnout, this thing just lit up the tires. It was the most fun to drive out of all of the cars. Shifted beautifully. The car worked very, very nicely from start to finish. Chevelle second. A lot of Chevy guys there, LS6 guys, are going to be disappointed. We haven't cheated anything. We haven't changed tire pressures. We haven't cheated the governors. We haven't reworked carburetors. We haven't unhooked sway bars. You know, a lot of these guys in the supercar shootouts are doing a bunch of things to make these cars run. This is the way the cars left the factory. These are the results. For my money, the Boss 429 wins.
And keep in mind that we used an absolutely average driver for all of this. So the Boss 429, I'm going to take the side of the Chevy things. And remember, all of you Mopar guys, it's Peter at dreamcargarage.com. All right? We'll see you next time.
Thanks.
I'd have to pick the Hurst Olds.
It was a 1970 LS6 Chevelle.
69 Boss 429.
GTO is kind of the granddaddy of the muscle cars.
70 LS6 Chevelle.
Probably the 70 Buick GS.
Well, I guess Hemi's got the name.
69 Boss 429 Mustang.
I'm going to predict that the Olds is going to clean up pretty good.
The Hemi Challenger.
The GTO Judge 69.
I'm going to have to probably pick the AMX.
Now you can own a copy of the Muscle Car Shootout on DVD for $24.95. Go to dreamcargarage.com or this 1-800 number. An extended version plus stuff we can't show you on TV.